Assalamu alaikum. So today we'll talk about ethics and ethical dilemmas. I'll give you an example first just to illustrate the point, and then we'll talk about the famous frameworks and schools of ethics, and then we'll talk about certain Islamic texts and where it falls. So let's take this following example. Let's say I am a psychiatrist and I'm treating a schizophrenic patient, right? And somehow this patient becomes convinced that he has contracted a virus, and he's demanding the doctor to treat his virus. Now the doctor obviously obliges and he orders all the tests possible, and all these tests come back negative. Still this schizophrenic patient is not convinced, and he's still coming back to the doctor asking for a treatment. He's totally convinced that he's infected by the virus. Now the doctor faces a dilemma. He either can choose not to take any action, but then he's risking the derailment of the patient. The patient will increase in his anger and his anxiety, wanting to treat this virus. Or maybe the doctor can indeed prescribe an antibiotic. So this antibiotic is indeed gonna treat a virus only if it existed. The problem is the virus is not there, so this is an unnecessary treatment that could also have side effects. It might harm or weaken the patient, and it also can derail the more important psychiatric treatment. So then the doctor might think, well, I'm gonna give this patient, I'm gonna prescribe placebo to the patient, right? So that way I could basically preserve my patient. He's not gonna be affected by any real medicine, and I'm gonna take care of his illusions, right? And his concerns, his anxiety. Now, this is not the end of it, because now the doctor faces what we call an ethical dilemma. On one hand, he might think that giving the placebo to the patient is good for the patient. After all, it's for the well-being of the patient. But there are basically two problems there. One problem is the deception involved in this act. And this is obviously not an ethical act. So if you just focus on the act itself, the act of deception is no way a good act or a moral act by all definitions. But there's another problem too. When the doctor prescribes placebo, it's as if the doctor is taking this autonomy from the patient. After all, it is a patient who should be making a decision like this, because it is a decision involving his body, his health, and it should be the patient making that decision, not the doctor making a decision for the patient. So in essence, in this case, the doctor is depriving the patient from his inner autonomy. So that is exactly the definition of an ethical dilemma. Now, in order to solve this dilemma, maybe we should maybe survey the major schools of ethics before we look at a solution. Maybe one of those schools, one of those frameworks, as we call them, is going to help us solve this ethical dilemma. So here I wrote, a summary of the schools. It's not encompassing, it's not all the schools, but it's the major schools that have existed across time. So the first framework or school is called or referred to as deontology. And basically this is the school that focuses on the action itself. So basically morality, to that school, morality is based on whether the action itself is good or bad, or right or wrong, and doesn't pay a lot of attention to the consequences of the action. The second one is called divine command theory. So as the name implies, morality here is based on the command of God. So whatever God says is good, and whatever God says is bad, is bad. So that is the divine command theory. Number three is basically the school of reason So basically, the rational school. Ethics is built on rationale or on reason. This is basically a school adopted by Kant, and it was founded or mentioned at least by Plato from the old days. So basically here, and that's kind of similar to deontology, except that this is now putting more focus on the act of reason and reflection. So for an act to be a moral act, I have to have the capacity to reflect on this action and reflect on the merit of this action and be able to tell that this action is right or wrong. So basically, all moral values and principles are knowable by reason, a priori, before any experience. That is the premise of this school. And then we have the next school is referred to as consequentialism. And this is kind of the opposite of the previous school. So this school now focuses on the consequences of the action. All right? It focuses on the consequences of the action, not the action itself. So regardless of what the action is, we look and see how much good is happening as a result of this action. So all the focus is on the consequences. A similar school, very similar, is utilitarianism. So again here, the idea is that you focus on the utility of the action, right? And a famous expression here is that you want to maximize the benefit and reduce the harm. That is really the idiom of that school, that you want to maximize the benefit and reduce the harm. All right? And when we say maximize the benefit, it talks about the act itself, that you want to make that act as productive as possible, but also you want as many people to benefit as possible. All right? So the more benefit you can bring to more people, the better and the more ethical the action is. There are like a couple more schools, not as famous, but I'll mention them anyways. There's a school called ethical egoism. So here morality is defined by self-interest. So the more good you can gain from an act as a person, the more ethical and moral the act is. So basically, the act is measured by its self-interest or its self-worth. The last one I'll mention is called the ethics of care. So basically, this is it pays attention to the empathy and care that we show to others. So a moral action centers on the interpersonal care. And the more you see empathy and care toward others, the better the action is. All right? So this is a quick survey of the schools, but I'm going to focus on the two major schools. And those two schools are opposite of each other. All right? So the first school, utilitarian school, is best known by Jeremy Bentham. He's the one who wrote so much about it and who elaborated on this idea of utility in the action. So that is really, really important. And the exact opposite of that school is the school, let's call it the Kantian school. If we want to put two philosophers up against each other, you're going to have Jeremy Bentham on one hand, you're going to have Immanuel Kant on the other hand. So Kant would argue that actions are right and wrong by themselves, regardless of the consequences, right? And hence, morality is based on reason. It's not based on feelings. It is not based on consequences. And maybe let me give you a small example so we can tell the difference here. I mean, I think a lot of it is clear, but Kant has also this, this really, I would say, rigid definition of morality. So let's try and maybe peel it a bit more, peel the onion a little bit more. Especially when it comes to the categorical imperative, it might be a bit hard to understand. It's a jargon that some people use when they talk about Kantian ethics. But what is it exactly? So let's take the example of an animal like a cat or a dog. According to Kant, um, animals are not even capable of morality because of his definition. Because a cat, let's say a cat eats a bird, or a dog, saves a person, right? Those acts cannot be even classified as evil or good according to Kant. Because unlike a human, an animal is not capable of reflecting on their act. A cat is not capable of reflecting on the pain it's going to inflict on the bird. It just does it out of instinct, out of feelings, out of desire, whatever you call it. It's not based on reason. So it's not capable of comprehending, of understanding the pain it inflicts. Likewise, the dog is not thinking about the goodness of the act it's going to bring. It's not going to think about the pleasure necessarily of the human once you save that human, right? So hence those acts, although they're good, no one is denying that that one act is good. The saving of a human being is definitely good, and the eating of your bird, especially if it's your bird, is evil. But it is not morally evil. So morality doesn't even come to the picture in those cases. I hope I gave justice enough to the Kantian idea. Now, obviously, I am, as a morally responsible agent, I am capable of good and evil. So hence, my actions could be classified as either good or evil, or moral and immoral. All right. So I hope I have given enough time to explain the major schools. Let me talk about Islam and where it stands in all of this. On one hand, if you listen to Muslim scholars, you see them referring a lot to the concept of maslaha and mafsada, which means good and harm, or benefit and harm. And you see a lot of times the way they decide on a particular issue, whether it's good or bad, they look into maximizing the benefit and reducing the harm. That actually is, we call it qaida fiqhiyya. It's a fiqhi principle. It's a jurisprudence principle. They also talk about the least of the two evils, right? So you could see that there is a lot of similarity between that and the utilitarian school. Right? However, this is not always the case. If we look into the primary text in Islam, the Quran and the Sunnah, you're going to see some evidence of the rational school. All right? And I think the best example of that is actually found in the Quran immediately after the story of Cain and Abel, Qabil and Habil. Because obviously the story talks about the killing, and it talks about a brother killing, a brother. So obviously that is an evil act. It's an immoral act. And there, the Quran talks about something that was written on the children of Israel, but that's applicable to everything, to everybody, not just to those tribes. But it says that, and because of that, it was written that whoever kills one person, it's as if they have killed the entire human race. And if they saved a person, then it's as if they have saved the entire human race. That is really, really interesting, because at least on the surface, it looks like this is totally anti-consequentialist. In essence, it seems like the verse is saying that killing one person and killing the whole human race is kind of equal. That's not what the verse says, but definitely it is appealing to the school of deontology and rational thinking. And because here the focus of the verse is not about the consequences. This is why it says as if, right? You kill one person, it's as if you killed everybody. But really the focus here is on the act itself. The fact that the act is so evil, the consequence may not even matter. Because we want you to pay attention to the action itself. Because, the act of killing defiles you. and it's such an immoral act. And it can lead into all kinds of problems. Obviously, you're making it easy on others to commit the same act. So there are obviously some consequences like that as well. Anyway, the reason I brought it is to show that no doubt Islam pays attention to the act itself and the morality of the act itself. And we can base morality on the act sometimes, even if we don't pay attention to the consequences. Now, is this true all the time? No. I think Islam has a very, very interesting opinion about this. I think Islam basically occupies a middle ground between these two opposite schools. And I think this is the best way possible. When it comes to ethics, the best way or the best methodology is to find this middle ground, is to reconciliate between these two, because in each school there's good. And it's not, I mean, it's a loss to have, to abandon one school totally. And I think if we want to summarize it, we could say that in general, we can say that what is important is the act. So we can follow the, rational school. That's fine. But there are going to be some exceptions. And in those exceptions, we're going to have to look at the consequences of the actions. Let me elaborate a little bit. Let's take the example of lying, telling lies. No doubt that telling lies is an immoral act. So we could say, for example, that telling lies, not telling the truth, is immoral in and of itself. And we have a clear hadith from the Prophet, peace be upon him, related to that. One time, the Prophet ﷺ was speaking to his companions, and he was asked, can a believer be a coward? And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, yeah, it is possible. I mean, in our human nature, some people are more courageous than other people. And then he was asked, can a believer be stingy, like a miser? And the Prophet said, yes, it is possible. Some people are generous, some people are not. And then he was asked, can a believer be a liar? And the Prophet said, no. So here we see that the Prophet drew a clear line, and he said it's not possible, it's not feasible for a believer to tell lies and to be a liar. So obviously in this hadith we see it is appealing to the, whether we call it the deontological school or the rational school, but definitely it's paying attention to the action itself, not the consequences of the action, right? Now, if we look at certain cases, we see now that there is, a going back to the utilitarian school. For example, the Prophet said in a different narration, he said, telling lies is okay if you're trying to bring two people together. So let's say two people are not talking to each other. They have a dispute or whatever, but they decided not to talk to each other. And you, as a mediator, you go to the first person and say, do you know what the other person has said about you? He said this and this and this good things about you, right? So the other person never said anything good, but you're telling a lie in order to bring those people together. All right? So you start saying the other person have said so much good things, so many good things about you, and your intention is to, bring them together, right? And you go to the second person and you do the same thing. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, encouraged and commanded this act, right? Because there's a really, really good consequence of that action. So here, in this case, the Prophet was willing to overlook the evil of the action itself, because lying is still an evil act, all right? So the act of lying in itself is evil. But because the outcome is much, much better, it trumps and it overweighs the evil of that act. And that's really what I want to talk about here. What I want to, bring home is the fact that we can reconciliate between the two schools. And basically by looking both at the act and the consequence. I mean, why just look at the act, or why just look at the consequence? Why not look at them together and look, and we can make a general rule and say certain acts are good, certain acts are evil. But in some cases, if the consequence of those acts is so overwhelmingly good, or so overwhelmingly bad, then we also have to consider the consequences. All right, so in general, the act itself has its own merit. It's either good or bad, and that's something we cannot overlook. But sometimes, in certain cases, there's going to be some consequences that are so important, so essential, that we cannot overlook. And those could become more important than the act itself. I hope I did justice to this topic. And as I said, I think Islam plays a very intricate role in this subject. And it's really a very even-headed position it takes in between those two schools, which, like I said, both are really important, both are really convincing, both are really essential. But I think it's going to be, at the end of the day, it's going to be determined case by case, and we have to appeal to both schools. We cannot just ignore one school or always, defend one school at the expense of the other, or adopt one school at the expense of the other. I think we should look at both and get the best out of the two. Thank you very much for listening. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.